You're listening to Trending with Timmerie, offering an eternal perspective on today's hottest topics. National speaker Timmerie Millington has been a passionate advocate for life as long as she can remember, helping Gen X through Z answer the call to true feminism and authentic manhood. Timmerie holds a master's degree in biblical theology, and she covers this week's hottest stories from a Catholic worldview. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie.
Good morning, everyone. I hope you guys are doing well, depending on where you're at. It might be the evening, afternoon. You can always take us with you in the car by turning your phone into a mobile radio. That way you never have to miss an episode of Trending. Just head over to radiotrending.com in case you don't get to hear of all of today's show. Or maybe you want to go back to an old show you heard of trending. Just head to radiotrending.com. I have with me in studio today a guest who really has incredible expertise in character formation, especially of adolescents, young children. In his work through his PhD dissertation, he's looked at the formation of the two sexes as a male and female and how important that virtue formation is. At a time when sexual education is being incredibly confused and the roles of parents is really becoming disintegrated or ignored, this is important to get back to our roots of what has the Catholic Church been calling us to. So today we'll be getting into a well-integrated person and what that means and how that really begins at home. Today, my guest is Dr. Phillip Chavez of the Men's Academy. He's the founder and president and doing incredible work specifically with men on calling them into their mission.
Yeah, and it's something I really enjoy doing, but it was that dissertation that led to that. And yeah, we all want well-formed men, and that's what we're aiming for at the Men's Academy.
And you don't have to be someone who's parenting or teaching adolescents, but in fact, all of us, I truly believe, have holes in our own formation. Small areas that are easily overlooked.
Sure.
Maybe a parent didn't have a certain area of formation, or we ourselves weren't akin to receiving that level of formation as well.
Exactly. So, and there's different ways of discovering what good, solid human formation is. And by ongoing reading, discussing things with others, there's many different ways. But also, ultimately, I think we find it in the example of Christ. And despite where anybody's at, I think we have to remember our life is we're called to be in conformity with Him. As long as we're walking with Him, I think we can get to where we need to go.
Now, this is a really big deal if we dive into it. Dr. Chavez, I've been looking at studies. We've been seeing really since about 2013, 2014, there have been trends showing that teenagers are the most stressed out group here in the United States. And in fact, that stress level only elevates as they get ready to go back to school and walk through the school year.
Sure.
And when you ask teenagers how they expect their stress level to be in the near future and distant future, they expect to be more stressed out. In fact, they're more stressed out than adults. And college students, about 40 to 60% of them are saying things such as they have extreme anxiety, depression, and with the teenagers, there's this tendency to suicide and these mental health issues, all of it tied together, that is really pointing to the fact that adolescence should be a period of transition, transformation, but instead we're seeing it's a form of mental illness today.
Yeah, and I think what happened, I think there's a case for many of the students. Remember, the stress may be found in the student as in many ways he may have worries or feel self-judged or whatnot. But remember, the stress comes from a fear kind of response that probably was started when the child was in the womb. So if a child has a mother who's been stressed, I think even more and more we find ourselves more in stress situations. And so if a mother's stressed carrying a child in the womb, that's going to actually stress out the child too. And the first 2 years also of development, they're vital to help the child be at peace and be steady. So if a mother too is stressed or she's working, she's overbusied, then the child won't develop properly. And so my opinion is for many of these kids, that's kind of was there an incipient problem.
Well, and this goes back to the entire cultural challenge today having to do with we're living in a society that is so busy. And if you look at overall reviews of female happiness, women are less happy,
right,
less satisfied than they were before. And in fact, a couple months ago, we did a show talking about who's the happiest, who's the most satisfied. And in fact, it's women, faithful women who are practicing their faith, living in more traditional homes where they're caring for their children and living in the home, not necessarily having to balance everything of working and raising children at once.
That's right. And we have to remember, fundamentally, happiness is found in love, and love is encountered in relationships. And I think what's happened is we've made life so much about the goals and the things we try to obtain. And even we can even be caught up in the good works that we do, even for a great cause and a noble end and the common good. But I think overall, if our life is not centered in relationship, we're not going to be well navigated. And all of these things, stress and depression, all these things can be easily result.
As we talk about this, we have to hit on what are some of the areas where the teens are also mentioning stress. Because I want to start, you said a second ago, Dr. Chavez, that was so profound that, in fact, the stress level is actually being developed in the child in utero and in their early first couple of years. So the stress of the mother in utero, those stress hormones can impact the child's development, psychological development, and then even those first couple of years. But what are some of the questions of teenagers when they're asked, okay, what's bothering you? They're actually sharing that social media, smartphones, body image, self-perception is a huge thing. And they're actually saying that this cell phone social media use is actually essentially creating a lot of low self-esteem, comparison, anxiety, depression. To what point? To what point is what we have to ask? Why are these teens experiencing that? Because it's a distraction from their own selves, their own natural developments. It's a distraction from really allowing themselves to be confident in who they are in relationships rather than this dependency on social media.
Right. And again, I think in some way we're going back to some of the initial problems where if a child didn't get much validation and love growing up and much attention, and in this case, even like a much effective attention from the parents, they're going to be, I think, ultra sensitive. And so they're going to be worried about being judged, or they're going to be worried about conflict. They're going to be worried about being badgered or something like that. And so I think kids, one of the difficulties is social media. It causes all these fear mechanisms to rise and cause them to fear and be insecure about many things.
In fact, I was just hearing that there's a legislator that's getting ready to propose a bill that would really be addressing the fact that modern day tech companies, social media companies, Amazon, Google, you name it, are actually, and we've talked about this, they view their customers as, quote, users. Other than the drug industry, not many other groups actually view their companies as users. But it's specifically to address the issue that psychologically these companies are consulting with people to create psychological addictions to their different forms of media. And so as we're talking today about character development, you have to remember that things such as overuse of technology and not learning temperance and moderation can really impact this character formation.
That's right. And ultimately, Timmerie, we're supposed to be acting such in happiness and in love when we move from the inside out. Even our faith should move from the inside out, us witnessing Christ and moving outward. The problem with social media and exposure to other forms of media is that we learn to be entertained. And so we don't move and operate so much internally. We let the outside affect us, or rather in this case, disaffect us. So it keeps a child from thinking properly, keeps them from reasoning. But also, one of the difficulties of social media, it causes an instant gratification. And so this is why some become addicted, because they want to go back to their phones because there's something that feels good about getting a new text or a new post or something like that. So I think what happens is kids are being fed so much and they're being charged and entertained and stimulated that I think they'll find themselves in depression when they don't have these stimulations.
That's Dr. Phillip Chavez of the Men's Academy. You were listening to Trending with Timmerie. Let's be honest, it's not just teenagers who are experiencing this. I think this is relevant for all of us.
I think that's right.
And the reality is we do need more character formation. We look to the catechism and it talks about how we need to be rigorous. We need to be disciplined. And at times we need to be more intense in that formation, usually when you're younger, so that it can be formed, that character. But the problem is a lot of people never receive that formation. And so the rigor is having to take place later in life after habits and a lifestyle where some of this rigor seems extreme.
That's right. And so part of what we need to do to help correct this, and all of us need to do this, even if there aren't any struggles, is that we need to be doing things for which we internally reflect every day. This is why prayer is important. Prayer actually helps the personality. Why? Because it starts from internally. One thinks, cogitates, meditates, and then sends sentiments out to God. And so meditation, thinking, cogitation, even just simple reading is what adds to kind of development where we learn to move from the inside out.
This is what the saints in the Catholic tradition stands on.
Absolutely.
Yet, if you look at psychology, even a lot of the medical field, they're starting to say, you need to do something like some meditation.
That's right.
You need to pause. Maybe you need to stretch for a bit. They're saying this because what's missing is the ultimate act of worship in the human soul.
I think that's right. In extension to that, I think just even the contemplation of even just natural truths that are elevated truths, just things to think about which elevate our minds and hearts. Even poetry does that. That's why that's so important. But yes, other things of spiritual reading where we can read about the higher things, God, the angels, Jesus Christ, the saints. These are all thoughts which lift us up and help ennoble our personalities.
And that prayer life has to come first. You know, the saints recommend 30 minutes a day of prayer. We
Sure.
need to be praying when we rise, pray before we go to bed, and not just a quick mumbled prayer as we fall asleep, but intentional.
That's right.
On our knees. Carve out that daily time. Make it a habit so that a month from now, 6 months from now, you have the habit where you never miss morning prayer or you never miss evening and night prayer. These should be ingrained in us already.
That's right. And once those habits are ingrained, such we pray from the heart, we come to actually enjoy those things and want to do those things. And I find too, Timmerie, the more we can connect with God heart to heart, the more we'll come to understand heart to heart or connect heart to heart with other people.
Now, we mentioned prayer first, but what I was going to point to is how we actually really need to turn toward, like you said, poetry and reading. In fact, I love fantasy fiction. I'm not a sci-fi person, but I just did a post yesterday on my Instagram story talking about how I got the second book of the Taylor Marshall series, Sword and Serpent. And the book's story is excellent. It's about the legend of St. George, and he puts a lot of early church history into it. But even things such as good literature allows us to be at rest and even to contemplate truths if it's good literature.
Timmerie will be right back. Send her a tweet at Timmerie. That's TIMMERIE. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie, where morality and culture meet, offering an eternal perspective on today's hottest topics.
So what's the answer? Earlier in the show, I talked about how the APA, that's the American Psychological Association, talked about how teens have higher levels of stress than ever before, and in fact, even higher levels of stress than adults. We broke that down earlier. We're going to be diving into more of the answers. We talked about prayer, reading, and many other elements prior. Before we do that, I want to really call everyone, especially in the state of California, or if you know people in California, to a majorly important action alert. I like that, majorly important. So in California, some of you may know that we're fighting Senate Bill 24. We've been fighting it for 2 years. It was defeated last year because Governor Jerry Brown vetoed it. But now what's at risk is that if this bill passed, we're looking at over 500 additional abortions per month taking place in the state of California, because the bill proposes that all UC and Cal State University schools in the state of California, public schools, need to offer RU-486 abortion pills, which are so damaging for women in their bodies, but also it destroys a human life. And so we're calling everyone to take action. We need to get a letter sent over to one of the offices who's really doing fantastic work here in the state of California to really speak up and advocate for the severe damage that's being done if we allow this to go on. So I'm asking you, I'm tweeting this out and posting it on Facebook. Essentially what's happened is California Fair Life has put together a letter. If you send your letters to them, they're going to send all of them to the senators and those who are voting to ask them to vote no on SB 24. But you need to get them in before August 19th. So please keep an eye out. We'll be addressing this, and make sure you send your letters in.
And where can they download that form?
So I'm posting them on social media. You can find me at Timmerie on both Twitter and Facebook. I have in studio with me, I almost said Jimmy G. My sound engineer just saved me because I was messing up with the clock here. He is really the nimble fingers behind the soundboards and everything operating here to deliver crisp sound with awesome radio coaching here. In studio with me today is my dear guest, Dr. Phillip Chavez of the Men's Academy. I want to get into some of the answer to the crisis right now with teen depression, anxiety, and the confusion. and that is parents as primary educators.
Sure. That's a big topic. I hardly even know where to start. But again, I think it's important that teens, even at all stages of development, especially as they move through their teenage years, children need to learn that family is what's most important. It's interesting. I remember a quote of Pius X. I think he summed it up well. He says, "The end of all education is to form boys to be husbands and fathers and girls to be wives and mothers." And so what's happening when we're forming children now, we're not forming them for family life. We're forming them to accomplish things and to do what they need to do to get into a good college someday so that they can get a great job and then make a lot of money. But so there's so much of an orientation of kids to what they're doing and not who they are. And there needs to be simply more communion in the home, and a restoration of activities which bring together that communion. Especially, I'm even surprised now how many families increasingly don't even have dinner together.
Well, and I look at what you're saying, and it's essentially a turning away from the relational element of the human person and reducing it to this productivity that just creates stress and tension.
That's
and
right.
You look in the extracurricular activities that are too much. Out of the mouths of teenagers, they're complaining that they're overwhelmed. I've heard I was talking to someone the other day, about 30 years old, and said, "Yeah, I actually wish I did less activities. I remember how stressed out I was in high school."
Yeah, and so I think one of the difficulties is it's in the nature of a child to try to please their educators, their coaches, their parents, and whatnot. And I think there's a high-level expectation that's put on kids now to accomplish, to succeed, to do many things. And I think if we put less expectation on children and learn to accept them for who they are, I think that would help in great measure.
In the early 20th century, we had Pope Pius XI and Pope Pius XII, as I read in much of your dissertation work, really talking about how essentially the shrinking of parents to fulfill their educational responsibilities, and in fact, their outright neglect, because at times it is intentional, or there's a fear, there's anxiety, and so they say, okay, I'm just going to put it over here. But the popes, Pius XI and XII, referred to this as actually evil, and it goes against what the Catholic family is called to.
That's right. The Catholic family is ultimately to form, we could say on a spiritual level, we're called to ultimately form in Christ, to take on the person, the identity of Jesus Christ, and to move in his image. More proximately, at least in terms of overall formation, we want to emphasize that it's character formation, which is the end of all education. And I forget where Pius XII makes that very clear. And so even when you send your children to a school, the formation of their character is what is paramount, not that they're educated well in all of these subjects. And so character formation is what is to be paramount and in the navigation of all parents when they're raising their children.
So essentially, the parent's goal is to have a well-adapted child that can handle whatever crisis or challenge occurs. Yet instead, these children are being sent, especially here in the public school system in California, into an already hostile environment to their character formation, so that the character formation has a real difficulty in developing.
I think that's right. And the state now tends to think in a very communist, Marxist, Naziist kind of mentality that the children actually belong to us. We're responsible for their education. We know what's better than the parents, and the parents really don't have any kind of primal role. We have the primal role. And so without any kind of cooperation with parents in the role of education, it's going to go in a bad direction.
We've talked about this before on Trending, how essentially some of the countries that have the highest test levels, in fact, go to school a lot less. I mean, for example, Finland has, I think, the second highest in math, reading, language, and they have less than 4 hours of school per day, for example. And I was looking at, there are moments, I'll never forget, Aristotle, I read something from him a few years ago where he said that for every book you read of the current century, you should read 2 or 3 of a different century, because it keeps checks and balances of human nature and how we're doing things differently, but what is true across all time. And so I thought about that when I was looking at, what are the number of hours that kids are spending in school today? I looked at 1905, so just a little over 100 years ago, and it showed that students only went to school about 105 days. And at the time, it was expected that they'd go to school about 151, but it wasn't mandatory. Today, in 2018, children go to school for an average of 180 days. So again, on the average over 100 years ago, it was about 105 days. Now it's 180. It shows what's happened is children are spending increasingly less time with their parents.
That's right.
And that doesn't even add on all the additional extracurricular activities that are taking place to a fault, because extracurricular activities are good still.
They are good, but like all good things, they shouldn't be in excess. And I think what's happening is there is so much in excess where kids are just too busy now and too preoccupied to actually really even enjoy life. But I think what's happening too, again, we look at things in the past. Yeah, children definitely played more. They spent more time outside. Remember, the average child, or actually the average adult 100 years ago got 9 hours of sleep. Before the advent of the light bulb, that's pretty much what people had. And so much of what's going on now, many of the problems I believe we're facing in adults and children, and which is negatively impacting children more, is sleep deprivation. Children just aren't getting enough sleep and bodily refreshment to do the tasks, and so it takes them longer, and they don't do them as well.
Well, doesn't that go back to, okay, you have anxiety, you're depressed, start with sleep, start with food, and then start with exercise, all of which quality of we're struggling with, but that goes back to basic character formation, does it not?
Absolutely. Yeah, because in character formation, we have to form every part of the child, as the church teaches. So, and Pius XI breaks that down into 7 areas. He says, and these are all things parents must be attentive to.
That's Dr. Phillip Chavez. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie. Let's touch on those just a little bit. So intellectual formation, education, right?
Sure.
But not just how much data do you have, but also there's an element of wisdom that should be developing in intellectual formation.
That's right. And remember, when the church, I think it's good to go back, when the church ever speaks of education, it's not about formal instruction. It's about fullness of character development. And so with intellectual formation, yes, that's there must be, of the 3 gifts, we have wisdom, understanding, and knowledge. And so a child must be trained in wisdom to see the higher things, in knowledge to understand a number of different subjects, and in understanding to understand the more proximate principles of things. So yes, in education, children must be exposed or have formation, all those 3 different types of knowing.
And right now we're reducing it to information.
That's right.
Without understanding and without wisdom.
That's right. And again, the understanding of wisdom, yes, goes back to some of the more serious reading we can do. You even mentioned Aristotle. There are other authors that can help us see the purpose in things. And so in guiding students, or guiding children, this is what parents need to do. When they do it in their intellectual formation, they must help children understand the nature of things and the deeper reasons for things.
Now, can you speak to the emotional formation that Pope Pius XI or 12th?
Both of them spoke much about emotional formation. Every child is supposed to have all adults even, we're supposed to be developing into where our emotional makeup is consistent, constant. So where we're usually at a study of peace and calm, where, we're supposed to have anger at right moments, but not excessive. I think we really believe depression is a cause, too, of what's happened without proper emotional regulation. And so a parent helps a child, especially a mother. Women have these great gifts for, they have a very, I'll use the word complicated or sophisticated emotional makeup by which they can help empathize with a child and help move and guide its emotions and calm a child. There's a way a mother can calm a child the way a father simply can't. And so when parents are attentive to the emotional makeup and dynamics of the child, they can attend to a child when they're getting too angry or they're fear or frustrated, all these other things. And so that kind of formation needs to be ongoing.
And this is a challenge. People get so emotionally thrown off by something that happens that so many young people, especially young girls, are on an emotional roller coaster today. So we're going to be diving in when we come back more about the parents' role and how we can form our characters.
You can listen to more of Trending via the podcast on iTunes or the iHeartRadio app, where you can share your favorite episodes. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie.
We're talking about the formation of children, and as we talk about that, it's actually fantastic news to look at what's happening in Denmark and Florida. A little review as we see divorce has been very high over the last 50, 60 years since the sexual revolution. Denmark has actually stepped in to the point where they recognize they want to help children under 18. And so they're actually mandating for parents looking to divorce who have children under the age of 18 that the parents go through essentially an online course that's, quote, cooperation after divorce. after taking the course, the two parents that want to divorce have to wait 3 months to take this time of reflection to really consider the impact on their children and their responsibilities moving forward. So this program's just being implemented, but I think that it's good to really ponder, how is this going to impact the child? Because so often the idea is they'll adapt. It's fine.
Yeah, or that the parents really are looking too much at their own relationship and navigating life out of what they're getting out of their marriage instead of leading to the common good of what's good for the family as a whole. And so I think it's easy in today's day and age, and again, with social media and emotional difficulties and all these problems, we could tend to easily be so self-absorbed where our world is about how we're receiving our relationships. And so I think what's happening is we're looking too much, or individuals who are married, they're looking too much at their own needs and their own desires, and such that, life isn't good or won't be harmonious unless those are being properly met by the person in their life. But they need to see more and more people need to learn that no, marriage and love, it's about giving. It's about going outward from oneself's own needs to another's.
I remember reading an article, parts of it, on Trending a couple of years ago, and it was about this mom who had custody of her children, and it was on 1 week, off 1 week with her husband. And she was talking about how much she would look forward at the end of her week to being by herself, drinking the wine, kicking back, relaxing, and how, it made her such a better mom, because then she actually looked forward to seeing her kids again. But then she was ready for them to leave.
Sure.
And it just takes this mindset of, it puts me, myself, and I at the center of the whole situation, instead of the Catholic Church's teaching that the parent's responsibility is to, or the married couple's responsibility is to procreate and then educate and form that child.
That's right. And maybe to go back a step here, Timmerie, one of the things that I think why women are so exhausted, why parents are so exhausted, I don't think we get enough support from grandparents. There's a natural responsibility that grandparents have to support their own children and helping them raising their children. So you talk about this woman who feels exhausted, when her kids are with her, and she's so relieved when they're going away. The difficulty is what's happening is mothers are not getting enough support from other women around them, older women, that should be helping them raise their kids so they can have these moments of refreshment, which they aren't experiencing so much today.
And this is something we've seen. Studies are showing with the boomer generation, it's the first time you've seen the greatest distance between grandparents and grandchildren, because many are retiring to different areas with non-frequent visits. And so it's a challenge to really center yourself to the best of your ability. And I understand there are challenges in an environment of support and ideally the family to form the family.
Exactly. And so I think of the earlier problems we're talking about, children with depression and anxiety and all these things, I think if they had their grandparents around them, their uncles and more of their family and more family time, I think all of that would diminish. Again, the importance of grandparents and uncles and aunts and whatnot, always being involved in the formation of the child and trying to be as much a community as possible. This helps for the development and the well-being of everyone involved.
We have to remember also that the Catholic Church, the members of the church, are a part of our family. And I think this study coming out of Florida really speaks to this. It's incredible. Dr. Phillip Chavez is here in studio from the Men's Academy. Check this out. Between 2015 and 2018, Duval County in Florida saw a 28% plunge in their divorce rate. And here's what happened. One gentleman, in fact, a Catholic gentleman who back in 2008 wanted to go to D.C. to help change the world by working in politics, saw the importance through his own experience of needing to work on the family. And so going back to Florida, took up this philanthropic study and ended up finding that if parents, married couples, were invited to come to church, that in fact the divorce rates would plummet. And so what he did in his study in implementing this over the 3-year period is he worked in funding so that churches within a 5-mile radius of their church could send out direct mail, social media campaigns, and advertisements getting people into the church. And this helped reduce the divorce rate.
That's right. Remember, we're ordered not just to family life, we're ordered to community as well. And so good communities form good states. And so this is why the state does have a very vested interest in preserving families. But Also, it's incumbent upon the state to recognize that, yes, fostering religion, fostering the faith, or churches rather, that and those communities, it's really does work for the well-being of all. And when in these smaller group communities, parents are able to find the support, they're able to find some mentoring that they need. They're even to help with even the raising of their own children and whatnot, even some religious training. And so there's so much that churches, especially even smaller churches, can offer. This is why it's always good when, unfortunately, the Catholic Church, we're adopting more and more into this mega church concept, and I think we lose some of that personal touch. And so when we can get back to the churches, somehow we make life again more personal and more communal.
We have this underlying principle that when you go to church, it's developed and begins to be understood of why these relationships are so important. So this dives into a bigger question. For those who are just joining us, that's Dr. Phillip Chavez of the Men's Academy. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie. Shout out and hello to all our new listeners, especially those listening on Spirit Catholic Radio Network. What I want to dive into is the challenge of many parents who, we talked earlier, some are often intentionally kind of defaulting and just saying, okay, I'm going to send my kid over here, whether it's for faith formation, education, whatever it might be. Some of it might be economic reasons, fear of not being able to fulfill the duties, whatever it might be. But what parents are often recognizing that they feel untrained, and also we find that they're inattentive because of their lack of role models and upbringing that has now been taking place for generations. And so there's this fear and anxiety that sets in for them, that they feel inadequate.
Sure. Yeah, and I think what's happened, and this is where I thought you were going to move into more directly, when it comes to, let's say, for example, which is the example I want to bring out, is faith training. The church has clearly taught that the faith training is really found in the home. And I think what's been a real crisis in the Catholic and other Christian churches is that we need to learn that it's the family that should be the ones imparting the faith. Instead, what's happened now, parents now expect that to happen in the schools and in the parishes. Well, there's an extent certainly where they have that role to supplement what the parents are doing, but the parents are the primary educators of the child in general, but all the more so that holds with supernatural realities. And I really believe one of the reasons why children are falling away from the faith is the failure of the parents, not just cooperate with that faith and foster it, but to actually be the primary teachers and to see that that's their mission, to communicate the faith to their children.
And part of the challenge is the inattentiveness, the overly busyness that prevents this, but also the busyness of extracurricular activities that burden you so much that you delay and you delay and you delay. To the point where 18 years later, that child's gone off to college, has really lacked any solid formation. Their major questions about faith and morality were never answered. And then, is there any surprise they stop going to church? That's
right. And gosh, we all hope and pray that they could find their way back through other mentors or other people that come in their lives. But yes, if that faith is really fostered in family life and in routine worship of the family together, much is going to be lost. And yes, but again, I think, the primal reason is that if the faith is communicated by the parents and fostered and lived and really witnessed, they're going to really suffer. In fact, this holds all the more so for the father. And so even by canon law and by church teaching, the father has the primary role, especially in religious formation. And at the end of the day, they say roughly statistics are about 2/3 of all children go the way of the father, because he is that ultimate spiritual authority in the home. And ultimately, the children will go in his direction.
And this gets back to the church and its teaching it as the man in his born right, as leader, as protector, as provider, that priestly role that's so important in the family that the father holds.
That's right. He's that priest, prophet, and king who serves selflessly in Christ. But yes, the prophet who he must teach. And it's interesting, Timmerie, when I talk to some parents, at least very conscientious parents, they find a great joy in teaching their children the faith. It's not something that's arduous or something that's a pain to them. They find it to express the faith and teach the mysteries of the faith. They realize how that primal duty, when they carry it out, what great joy it gives them.
And there's ultimately growth that's taking place in the parent as well. Right. They're learning their faith more, or they're learning it in a different way because of how they're having to accommodate and teach the child, no matter what the age range might be.
Absolutely. And any subject, when we take on the role of teacher, we can tend to know a subject in a whole different realm. We have to understand a whole different way. And yes, to boil it down sometimes in simple terms, appropriate for a child's age, that takes a thinking process about what one's teaching to communicate it to a certain age level. Yes, there is growth, a lot of growth in that.
And it's a matter of knowing your audience, because I can tell you when I'm talking about certain things having to do with abortion, gender ideology, I need to know my demographic, age, everything really well, because one group, it might work really well to share this truth, but another group, if they were to hear that, they might not be ready for it, and it actually might anger them and harden them to hearing the message of truth about human sexuality.
That's right. As that scholastic axiom, everything is received in the mode of the receiver. And so whenever we teach children, it's very important, and the church has emphasized this, we teach children for the level of that they can actually learn at, and try not to teach. You can challenge them a little bit, but it's always appropriate to teach audiences, be that child or any kind of audience, in a way that they could properly receive that information.
You can find Dr. Chavez and his work at the Men's Academy. Just head over to themensacademy.org. He has excellent work calling men into their mission, calling for deeper formation in Catholicism and masculinity. Thank you for being here, Dr. Chavez. We will be
pleasure.
We will be right back. We'll be talking more about character formation, addressing issues of anorexia and cutting, so don't go away.
Timmerie will be right back. Send her a tweet at Timmerie. That's Timmerie. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie, where morality and culture meet, offering an eternal perspective on today's hottest topics.
Timmerie here. I'm in studio with Dr. Phillip Chavez of the Men's Academy. You can find them at themensacademy.com. I have coming up some questions having to do with anorexia and cutting that were sent to me by a listener, and I think this is actually very relevant to the topic we have today, touching on just this identity confusion overall and the challenge to character formation. But first, I want to talk about a theme in Catholic theology that, has always been so fundamental, but sometimes is missing a component. Dr. Phillip Chavez, in your work, you talk about how, especially in the last couple pontificates, starting with Pope Paul VI, and really through much of the teachings of Pope St. John Paul the Great, we talk about the person as a gift. And we talk about how fundamental that is, that self-giving, life-giving love. But you actually talk about how in order to give yourself as a gift, you first have to learn that self-possession and custody of your faculties.
Yes. Well, in giving of oneself and in loving others, we always want to love according to what's good. Now, in order to do that, we certainly need to know what the good of the other is. And so this is where a lot of us can be mistaken on what the nature of love is. But when we truly and properly carry out the good of others, we need to carry out in such a way that that's harmonious. Loving others is an act of the will. And so if there's no self-discipline, say in the person, then their loving another might be indulging them or something, or it might be even on the other extreme to withdraw things from them. If a person isn't self-possessed, say in their emotional life, if they're inclined too much to anger, their anger is going to come through in what they think are loving acts. So if a parent may find themselves in disciplining their child, which they must do, if they discipline in anger and they're not self-possessed emotionally, and with a sense of calm and peace in their hearts, and they do their best, but if they do it in a tone of anger, that is going to disaffect the child.
Interesting. So this is where that gift of self is challenged by lack of formation ultimately. And so this is where we need to regain that balance again of character formation comes first, because you can't give what you don't have. That's what it comes back to. That's
right. And so sometimes, as parents, they easily make the mistake on what's good for the child. Maybe an excess, of too many things outside the home is not good, when there needs to be more home time. It's a loving act to get children together, especially for dinner time. These things and others like that, where more communal activities within the family are fostered, that definitely brings a more loving environment.
Can you speak to some other practical examples of formation?
Much of especially as you talk about self-possession and things alike, are proper emotional adjustment. We have to remember much of that happens in early life, in early childhood, and so sometimes, say when a child is growing, the parents have to be very observant of what's going on in the child. So if a child is easily frustrated, a parent should be attentive to that and to try to teach the child to be calmed down. If a child is rushing at things, a parent needs to see that, I got to teach my child now how to calm down and do these things more orderly prematurely. Or if they're doing things, say, in haste or without right cause, sometimes if a child begins to understand what it's doing properly, and the causes and the reasons for why, that's a good thing. And sometimes, too, we expect children to carry out certain tasks without properly showing them how to do it. And so, sometimes parents will get frustrated with children when they take out the trash. Well, you should be a good example and show children actually how that's to be done, and do it in a calm demeanor and not a demeanor by which you're stressed or you're angry or frustrated or whatnot. All teaching should be done in peace. But again, children need to be shown many things that you ask them to do, because if it becomes a mystery about how to carry it out, the child's going to be otherwise frustrated on that level as well.
This challenge to emotional maturity makes me think of how they're showing in a lot of studies that some kids, if they're pulled away from their cell phone for a period of time, all of a sudden experience all these emotions that they don't know how to understand, and it's overwhelming. They've never experienced boredom, or they've never actually allowed themselves to just feel that sorrow without the distraction, the dopamine kicks of the notifications from social media and the phone. And so one thing, and I've seen one of my friends do this really well with her kids, that she'll really, if the kid's got something going on that's distressing, she'll try to understand, okay, what is he or she saying, right? Sure. And then say, okay, I'm sorry you're feeling sad right now, and then go through trying to both acknowledge like the feeling or acknowledge what they're saying, so that gives that affirmation to the child and allows them to understand themselves so that they can move past it.
That's right. And I think that's very good. Yes, the child should somewhat understand the nature of its own emotions. So yes, when a parent can help identify those emotions and validate that, oh, I see you're being frustrated because of this. Oh, I see you're angry because of that. Sometimes it's often good to validate these things and identify, okay, and then ask, okay, what's the source of this? Maybe we could sort this out. Yes, and I think the emotional life needs to be validated, and emotions at all levels. And there's a reason for every emotion that a child has. And so for those negative emotions that arise, a parent does need to kind of examine those and look into that, for the child and help them through that.
That's Dr. Phillip Chavez. You are listening to Trending with Timmerie. I had a listener question come in, and it was really asking the question of, can you give me help regarding how to help people who are struggling with issues such as cutting and anorexia? And when I received this question, I thought it fell so well into this theme of this week of ultimately, I think at the heart of the issue is this need for character formation, so that prior to these things becoming an issue, the parent's aware, the parent is forming the character, the child's knowing how to navigate its challenges, because ultimately, especially the issue of anorexia, it's a form of, not perceiving reality as what it is. It's someone who thinks they're obese or hates their body for whatever reason. And at the heart of that is this lack of affirmation of their own person. I
think that's right. Now, so when it comes to things like anorexia or bulimia or cutting, maybe to make two comments. First of all, and not the most important, but usually if somebody gets to those levels where there's a serious episodes, they do need some professional help in many cases. But generally, as regards to the parents, I think in great measure we must understand anorexia or cutting as something which is physically played out, which actually the reality is in the heart. Mm-hmm. And so in anorexia, there is a deprivation of feeling love, this emptiness, believing one thing of another, that 2X, they're obese or something, they're actually very much not. Or in the case of cutting, that's a radical move for somebody to take that kind of step to their own body, which is very contrary to what it is to preserve our own selves. And I think, though, that's somewhat of a reflection of a division or a rupture that's going on with the heart of that person.
Well, and isn't this the same exact issue of this gender identity? It's become so trendy among teenagers as a cry for help, a cry for attention, a cry for unconditional love, that instead they no longer know if they're a boy or a girl. They're suddenly cutting, experiencing anorexia. I always say this, when I was a kid, anorexia and bulimia were a thing in the dancing world. Now, today, for teenagers, it's transgenderism to get a parent's attention.
That's right. And so it's good to validate the child or a little boy in those activities they're engaged in, and the girl she's engaged in. Boys, when they're young, they're going to be rambunctious. They're going to be They're going to be difficult in certain things. They're going to try to explore and be rebellious and whatnot. And so I think it's very important to try to validate what is proper in boyhood, and again, to try to bring it back to a right measure. But yes, if girls aren't validated and boys at a level by which their dignity is seen as boys and girls, male and female, yes, they're going to have all of these questions about their own sex identity. And,
at the heart of this, if a child can understand that they are unconditionally loved,
that's right.
It doesn't matter what you do to please me, nor does it matter what you do to fail. My love for you will never change. There may be punishment, ramifications,
yes,
but that love doesn't change. I think at the heart of this, that is now an affirmed human being who's no longer going to question or try to draw attention to themselves in order to get that love and affirmation.
That's right. And I think, Timmerie, it's interesting. I could be wrong when I say this, but I think the best way of showing unconditional love to a child is believing that you are unconditionally loved yourself, because you can't give what you don't have. And so for a person to receive love first and to walk through that journey, I think is vital, because otherwise they're going to be stressed trying to give that, if they even understand it, to their own children. And so this is why prayer in its primal dynamic is to actually receive God's love, His person, His identity into us. That's our first act, or the most open act of prayer. It is actually something very receptive.
So maybe you yourself are struggling with this lack of self-esteem, lack of love, lack of affirmation, whatever it might be. And often most people have different things and wounds festering in their own heart. This is where our faith is so fundamental, turning to God the Father as our Heavenly Father to heal every fatherly wound, turning to the Blessed Virgin Mary to heal those wounds, and taking them as our true parents that they are. When we say honor your father and your mother, there's a reason why it's at the beginning of the 10 Commandments, because it's really drawing closer to that honor of God and how that authority of the parents really ties into that as well.
Sure. And if we do what Scripture tells us, to go into our rooms and shut the door and pray to the God, in secret, and He who in secret will repay you. When we do open ourselves up to God in quiet, God repays us fundamentally with Himself, with His own identity, with His own personhood. And I think one of the reasons people don't experience this love and affirmation of God, oftentimes what I find is most people aren't doing enough of putting themselves in that quiet place so they can receive the God who does want to fill them.
Dr. Chavez, where can people find you in your work?
They can find me at themensacademy.org.
Now, sorry, .org. I think I said .com earlier. Mensacademy.org. Do you have any upcoming events?
Well, a big one we're putting together, which you spoke at last year. We're now going to be doing this flipping East Coast and West Coast. But the Masculine Genius Institute, the 4th annual summit, will be on September 21st in Philadelphia. So we're very much looking forward to that.
Excellent. So if you're on the East Coast or want to travel out, you can find information at themensacademy.org. Yes. If you would like to hear more topics covered on trending, you have a question, or hint, you want to give us a review, head over to radiotrending.com. You can pull us up on iTunes Podcast or Google Play and many other great resources for taking trending with you on the road. And by your review, you are giving support to our work and helping other people discover trending.
This has been Trending with Timmerie. To book her to speak or learn more about her guests, visit radiotrending.com. That's radiotrending.com. You can listen to more of Trending via the podcast on iTunes, Google Play, or the iHeartRadio app, where you can share your favorite episodes.